This week's Parsha is Va'etchanan, the second Parsha of the book of Devarim. And like every Parsha that precedes it and follows it, there's a lot going on.
Yeah.
Since we're recording, just for the information of those who may be watching at another time, can someone send Janet the link for Torah study? I send it out every Sunday, but for whatever reason, she doesn't have it. So if someone could forward it to her.
I got it.
Okay.
Thank you. So we concentrate on the first triennial, which is the triennial that we're in through the High Holy Days, at which point we'll transition to the second triennial. And that gives us time to delve in depth into that first third of each week's Torah portion, and then the accompanying Haftorah. Here she comes. So we begin, as we do every time we gather to read and study Torah, with the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And now if I could ask everyone to mute themselves until such time they have a comment or an inquiry, an insight to add, that would be appreciated. Va'etchanan means I pleaded. So Moses is asking God after the victories over Sichon and Og. He's feeling rather confident in the hopes that God will allow him to enter into the promised land. So that is why the Parsha, which actually the very first word is Va'etchanan, I pleaded. Now, as I have done many weeks before, the Chabad Kahot Torah overview, I'm not reading the whole overview, that just those parts that I think are germane to what we're going to be studying this morning. If you are in Hersh, it's on page 755. We are concentrating on chapter 3, verse 23 through chapter 4, verse 40. So here we go with the overview of Va'etchanan. As we have pointed out, the book of Deuteronomy is in effect a restatement of the first 4 books of the Torah, couched in such a way as to make them relevant for the generation that was about to enter the land of Israel. As such, the first Parsha of Deuteronomy, Parshat Devarim, parallels Genesis, the first book of the Torah. Just as the book of Genesis describes the historical background for the Torah in general, detailing the necessity for the creation of the Jewish people, so does Parshat Devarim describe the historical background for the restatement of the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy, detailing the events that necessitated the 40-year detainment in the desert and the rise of a new generation that would enter the land. The present Parsha, Parshat Va'etchanan, parallels Exodus, the second book of the Torah. The book of Exodus laid the theological underpinnings of the Jewish people's existence, their distinction from other peoples, their unique covenant with God and attendant belief system as the giving of the Torah, and their purpose as a people to make the world a home for God as encapsulated in the tabernacle. In a parallel manner, Parshat Va'etchanan describes the spiritual uniqueness of the new generation, restates the covenant with God on their level, which is the repetition of the 10 Commandments, and transforms the imperative to make God, the world, God's home into the basic central statement of Judaism, the Shema, which we studied again yesterday during Rabbi Epstein's class. This explains why, in Parshat Va'etchanan, Moses recounts historical events that preceded those he reviewed in Parshat Devarim. Although the events reviewed in Parshat Devarim took place later chronologically, in terms of the thematic development of the book of Deuteronomy, they come first. They provide the rationale for the repetition of the drama of Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah that forms the subject of Parshat Va'etchanan. Parshat Va'etchanan opens with Moses' description of how at the end of the 40-year detour in the desert, he once again pleaded with God to let him enter the land of Israel, and how God refused his request. In light of what we have just said, it would seem that this should form part of the historical material reviewed in the previous parasha, which concludes with the events immediately preceding Moses' prayer, which again was the victories of Sihon and Og. Why then is it placed here at the beginning of the parsha? Moses knew that the generation standing before him was not on the same level of spiritual perception as that of the preceding generation, who had witnessed the miracles of the Exodus and the giving of the Torah. He therefore understood that their confrontation with the materiality of the physical world would be a struggle, and that it would take time, perhaps a long time, until they would accomplish the purpose for which they were entering the land. He therefore wanted to accompany them into the land in order to boost their divine consciousness as much as possible to his level. True, they had not seen what he and his generation had seen, but they might be inspired by the intensity of his communion with God. If he would cross the Jordan with him, it might give them the strength to conquer the land and take possession of it in its fullest, most spiritual sense. As we will see, the spiritual perception of the generation of the desert compared to that of the generation of the conquest was like that of sight compared to hearing. When we see something, we do not need to be convinced of what we saw. We know it to be so. After all, we saw it. In contrast, when we hear something or hear about something, we may be convinced of what we heard, but our conviction can be overturned by persuasion and argument.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing is a direct perception and therefore incontrovertible, whereas hearing is indirect and therefore subject to challenge. Thus, even if the Jews of the generation entering the land of Israel would not doubt the truth of your Jewish beliefs for a moment, the facade of materiality would still have a louder voice in their minds than it ever could have had in their parents. The reality of God and the subordination of the physical to the spiritual had simply not been burned into their souls with the same intensity, which after all, how could it have been, since the previous generation had witnessed all of God's miracles, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Sea of Reeds, the giving of the Torah, the manna, etc. Thus Moses wanted to impart this spiritual sight to the new generation. Quote, God, you took the initiative to show your servant magnanimity. Please let me cross over and see the good land, end quote. Had he been able to see the land from within his eyes, it would have looked different to the entire Jewish people. But God only let him see the land from afar. Ascend the peak of Mount Nebo, lift up your eyes westward, northward, southward, and eastward, and see it, but only from afar, with your eyes, for you will not cross the Jordan River. Resigned to the fact that his people would not attain this level of divine perception, he instructed them to at least, quote, listen to the decrees and the laws that I am teaching you, end quote, thus setting the tone for the rest of his address to them, and indeed for the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. And again, if I could ask those who have yet to mute themselves to please do so, unless and until they have something to, a question to ask, an insight to share, whatever. So now we're going to turn to the text. And again, we start with Va'etchanan, chapter 3, verse 23. Now I'm going to read the first verse, 23 through 29, deal with Moses' prayer and God's rejection. So I'm going to start with 23, and we're going to start diving into the text and see what insights we can gather from that. Verse 23. I pleaded to God at that time, saying. I pleaded to God at that time, saying. Now, according to Hersh, Moses' prayer and its rejection, the signs of God's favor to his people, shown in the victories over the Amorite kings, stirred the personal hope of Moses that he too might see the good land that is beyond the Jordan. But it was not to be. He might view the land, but he would never cross there. He was to commit the future to Joshua, his successor. Now, you've heard me on several occasions read from short vort, which means a few words. And on this exact verse, I pleaded to God at that time, saying, here's a brief Davar. The Gemara says that, quote, nobody is exempt from trials tailored to his or her own specific level, end quote. Each of us will face many battles, both with the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and other distractions that keep us from serving Hashem. However, with prayer, we have the tool to which to overcome whatever obstacles stand in our way. The Midrash explains that when Moses was told by God that he would not be allowed to enter eretz Yisrael, he immersed himself in prayer. After the 515th request, God commanded him to stop, because with one more prayer, God would have been obligated to annul his decree. So evidently, the 516th request, God would have had to have granted. So in order to not have that happen, God said, stop. This teaches the immense power that a prayer has, strong enough that if Hashem would not have commanded Moshe to stop, he would have succeeded in completely overturning God's will. Mind-blowing to think about. But perhaps more importantly than that, through the gift of prayer, we literally have the ability to connect with Hashem whenever and wherever we choose. If we would really recognize that we have this ability, then we would not become distracted by meaningless trivialities. We would take the pockets of time where we usually get lost in thought and use them to develop a genuine and real relationship with God, because he is always listening. We do not need intermediaries. We have a direct connection. It's sort of like the radio. Until you turn it on, you don't hear the station. But it's always there. The station is always broadcasting. So it is with God. He is always there. He's always listening. We just have to turn the station on to receive it. So Rashi picks up on at that time. So his insight, after I had captured the land of Sichon and Og, scripture above in verses 18 and 21 in last week's Parsha has already stated that the time period was when they conquered Sichon and Og. Why emphasize here, quote, at that time? I imagine that the vow, God's oath not to allow Moses to bring the Israelites into the Holy Land, Moses thought that since God had permitted him to participate in the conquest and apportionment of the land of Sichon and Og, the oath had been abrogated. He thus prayed for forgiveness of his sin. However, the oath actually applied only to the land west of the Yarden, as yet unconquered. Thus, the oath remained intact. So the fact that God granted these victories east of the Jordan gave Moses a false confidence, if you will, that God had second thoughts about him not being able to enter the land. So he pleaded with him. And as you just read or heard in the Midrash, 515 times. He was nothing if not persistent. So verse 24.
Stuart, can I just ask a question?
Sure.
About the 515th time and the fact that if he had asked one more time, God would have been obliged to grant his request. Are there any examples of anybody who actually realized a request by going the whole distance 516 times?
Well, I don't know in the Midrash that there's a tally kept of how many tzaddikim through history pleaded with God.
Mm-hmm.
When Hezekiah was stricken with illness and pleaded with God and gave teshuvah, his illness was abated, and he ruled for several more years after that.
Mm-hmm.
And there's many, many of those types of instances.
Okay, well, thank you. That answers my question.
Verse 24. Adonai Elohim. So here you go with, like in the Shema, to the attribute of mercy, the attribute of justice. You have begun to show your servant your greatness and your powerful hand, that there is no power in heaven or on earth that can perform your deeds and your acts of power. So this is a common prayer where basically 24 through 26. So let me read 25 and 26, and then I'll give you, well, how about this? I'm going to read 24 through 26 out of the Chabad Lubavitch Torah, which again will give you additional insights. God, I know you are merciful even when meting out justice. For when the people sinned by making the golden calf, you took the initiative to show me, your servant, that magnanimity, that your right hand, which metes out loving kindness, is stronger than your left hand, which metes out strict justice and can overcome it. That is our prayers to make your mercy override your justice. And if you are familiar with the Kabbalah and the 10 Sephirot, compassion and mercy are on the right hand, and justice is on the left. Abraham was on the right, Isaac was on the left, and in the middle, the synthesis of both those was Tiferet, which was Jacob. That is why I'm praying to you now and requesting mercy. For who is like you, God in heaven on earth? Who can match your deeds and your might? Mortal kings have advisors who convince them not to be lenient or merciful, but you can do whatever you please. And I see now that you have begun to let me conquer the land. So as Rashi points out, because God let him conquer Sichon and Og, he thought the attribute of mercy might outweigh God's strict justice and allow Moses to enter the land. 25, my request, please let me cross over the Jordan River, complete the conquest of the land, see the good land that is on the other side of the Jordan River, including the good mountain that you chose as the location of the temple, and the constructed and functioning temple itself, which is termed the Lebanon, because it whitens. It comes from the root Lavan, which means white. It's also moon. which, remember, Jacob's father-in-law was Lavan. And just like the moon, it waxes and wanes. The sins of the people, please tell me whether you will grant this request. So verse 26, but God was angry with me because of my improper response to you when you complained against him at Kadesh, and he therefore did not heed me. God said to me, your entreaty in this regard suffices for me to understand how important this matter is for you. Speak to me no more regarding this matter. So somehow the Midrash extracted from these verses that Moses pleaded with God 515 times using biblical exegesis and the different hermeneutical principles that we have discussed a couple of months ago.
Stu, excuse me, what's the source of the 515 times?
The Midrash.
Okay. And Tiferet, you used the word Tiferet. What is the meaning of that? Tiferet
is one of the Sephirot. It is the synthesis, it's harmony or beauty, the synthesis of compassion and justice.
Thank you.
Speak to me no more regarding this matter, so that people should not consider me harsh and you pestering. Furthermore, a reward of your merits, much better than what you are requesting, awaits you in the afterlife. So God is basically saying, whatever you think you may be giving up in Olam Hazeh, this world, you're going to receive in Olam Haba, the world to come. So, but again, it's part of the prayer that Jews throughout the ages have said, may your attribute of mercy outweigh your attribute of strict justice. Verses 27 and 28, where Moses's hope is basically quashed. Go to the peak of the Pisgah, verse 27, and look around, west, north, south, and east. See it with your own eyes, for you will not cross the Yarden. 28, and command Yehoshua, encourage him, embolden him, because he will cross at the head of this people, and he will apportion to them the land that you will see. Now remember, through all of Deuteronomy, this is Moses talking, not God. And Moses recounting to the Israelites, telling and retelling the different journeys and what transpired through those 42 journeys as they lay right at the Yarden, ready to cross in and begin conquering the land. So now, verse 29, which ends chapter 3. We lived in the valley facing Beit Peor, the house of Peor. So that ends the historical review that Moses began in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, verse 6, when he began this first discourse. The historical portion of that discourse ends with chapter 3, verse 29. And Beit Peor takes us right to Shittim, because Shittim was the house of Peor. And what happened there? That's where the Israelites attached themselves to idolatry. When Balak told Balaam how to compromise the Jews spiritually with the Midianite and Moabite princesses. Remember Zimri and Cosby. This is where it happened. So now Moses has ended his historical narrative, and with the beginning of chapter 4, the importance of the commandments, which are basically verses 1 through 40 in chapter 4, which is the rest of the triennial that we are going to study this morning.
Stuart, can I make 2 comments before you go on?
Please.
First, there's an interesting midrash that gives another reason that Moses wasn't allowed to enter Israel. And it makes a relationship to Joseph, who, even though he died in Egypt, his bones were brought up and buried in Israel. Whereas not only not only did Moses not enter Israel, but even his bones couldn't be buried in Israel. And they make the comment, they make the connection in that Joseph was always considered a Jew, even when the servants brought him up to interpret a dream. They described him as the Jewish lad, whereas Moses was always considered an Egyptian, even when Zipporah brought him to Yitzro. She described him as the Egyptian who saved them at the well. So there was an interesting midrash, and giving another reason. And the other comment, and this I found very interesting. I heard this in a Davar, that if you think about Devarim as the entire book, it's the first time that Jews question what was in the Torah. Actually, it's the same concept as the Talmud. Here's another view of how the Torah was written.
Yes, because it was Moses's interpretation.
Exactly right. Here's Moses interpreting God's words, and that's exactly what Jews have done throughout the ages.
Yes, sir. And that's going to be a great segue to verse 2 when we get there.
Right, exactly.
First, I want to read.
When the commandments are changed a little bit.
Yes, sir. Verses, I want to read what Hersh has to say about verses 1 to 40, which can be found on page 756. The historical review in the preceding 3 chapters is now followed by an eloquent appeal not to forget what they had seen and heard at Horeb. Horeb is Sinai. The divine law, if obeyed, shall be their wisdom and understanding in the sight of the peoples. Let them remember the marvelous events at Horeb and keep far from all idolatry. Idolatry would inevitably be followed by exile. Nevertheless, even in exile, if they sought God in contrition and repentance, they would find him. Moses concludes with an appeal to their experience of the uniqueness of their God and pleads for wholehearted obedience to him. So let us read verse 1. And now, Israel, listen to the statutes and laws, the chukim ve'el hamishpatim, that I am teaching you to fulfill, in order that you will live and will arrive in and inherit the land that Adonai, the God of your fathers, is giving you. So this is setting up. He's placing the ball on the tee, and he's getting ready to elaborate on the points that he wants the people to retain, to remember, to inculcate.
It's also interesting because it talks about chukat or chukim, which is the decrees, and that's, if you remember, that's what we read in Parsha Chukat, and when we talked about the red heifer and a couple of other things that are simply done by decree. This is what God said, and nobody understands why. So there's two different concepts: the chukim, which are the decrees, and mishpatim, which are the laws.
And it's just, as we've said before, with the laws, one's intellect, mankind may have derived on their own without being told by God, do not murder, do not steal, etc. Now, verse 2, we're going to spend some time on this verse. So first I'm going to read Chabad's interpretations in the verse 2, and then we're going to delve into it even more. The commandments are perfect. You do not need to try to enhance them in any way. Do not add anything that I command you to what I command you, nor subtract from it. In order to observe the commandments of God, your God, that I am commanding you exactly as they should be observed. And needless to say, there's no way this could be done without the oral Torah. It's the primacy of the written and the oral Torah. They go hand in hand. For example, you will eventually be commanded to put 4 written passages of the Torah in your tefillin, which, of course, Rabbi Epstein spoke of yesterday. Do not instead put 5 in them. Since there are only 4 passages in the Torah that mention tefillin, adding a 5th passage about something else in order to expand the scope of the commandment will, on the contrary, mitigate the impact of the commandment. Similarly, do not hold 5 different types of plants on Sukkot instead of 4, since only the 4 that God specified have the property of augmenting joy. Holding a different type of plant which does not share this property would mitigate the effect of holding the other 4. A further example, do not attach 5 tassels onto a 4-cornered garment instead of 4 tassels, since the tassels are intended to remind you of the 4 expressions of God used when he described how he was going to take you out of Egypt. By adding a 5th tassel might make you think of something else, thereby mitigating the impact of this commandment. By the same token, in each of these cases, do not use 3 items instead of 4. So that's illustrating how we are not to add to or subtract from the commandments. Now I want to read Hersh on verse 2, you shall not add. A warning against weakening the force of the divine commandment by additions, omissions, or explanations that would dilute its original meaning or make it more palatable to human selfishness and desire. That, however, does not imply that the enactments of the Mosaic Code could never be added to or modified as new conditions warranted the change, provided all such modifications were not proclaimed as new revelations from on high. Now that's according to Joseph Caro. Rabbi Caro composed the Shulchan Aruch, the set table, the halakha. And if you've ever been to Israel and gone into his synagogue, I can't even describe the feeling. He lived in the Middle Ages. And of course, that's the go-to book, the Shulchan Aruch. So this is what Joseph Caro is saying. Israel was not to invent additions to the laws, nor arbitrarily diminish them. E.g., as we just read, for example, using 5 species instead of 4 and observing the command of the lulav, or placing 5 fringes on a talit, which was Rashi's insight. Now, Etz Chaim, bear with me, I got to get to the page, has this to say about do not add to or subtract from.
Page 107 or 1007.
I got it, thank you. Yet many laws and customs have been added and many dropped. Over the centuries, the circumstances changed. To legitimate the necessary expansion and evolution of Jewish law, the sages limited this prohibition to, quote, quantitative changes, such as adding a 4th petition to the priestly benediction, or a 5th passage to the 4 passages contained in the tefillin. Extensions and clarification of the law was not seen as adding. But needless to say, these extensions and clarifications were done by the Sanhedrin, by the Beit Din, by sages who had thorough and intimate knowledge, insights. A modern conservative perspective would see the Torah as a living organism, constantly shedding dead cells and growing new ones, changing and adapting to new and unprecedented circumstances. Extending the implication of a law to meet today's needs is not a case of adding or subtracting. So there's a distinction to be made between quantitative changes and conditions that when these laws were enacted that no longer apply to today, and the Torah, always being relevant, has to be reinterpreted for each generation because times and circumstances change. So there's a lot to process there and a lot to think about from that one verse. Verse 3, here we go again with seeing, re'eh. Your eyes have witnessed what God did regarding Baal Peor, that every man who followed Baal Peor, Adonai your God destroyed him from within you. Which Baal Peor was one of the Canaanite gods. Now, verse 4. This should sound familiar to you, and I'm going to chant verse 4 to you. See if it resonates with you. Va'atem hadverim ba'adonai Elohechem chayim kolchem hayom. But you who claim to Adonai your God, all of you are alive today. Needless to say, that's what we chant just before the chanting of the Torah. But you who cling to Adonai your God, all of you are alive today. And the implication is, of course, because of the Torah, which is why that verse is chanted just before the reading of Torah by the Gabbai. Bob, is your hand up?
Yes, it is. Stu, when they say wiped out at Baal Peor or Peor, is it literally wiped out, or are we talking an internal change to the body that they will never be the same again? Was it actually death?
Literally wiped out the entire population, even down to children.
Okay, so it was death for all.
Well, in terms of the Midianites or the Amalekites, there were certain peoples that God did command to be thoroughly eradicated. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, because I think it was in Devarim, they made a point at some part that for us today, we would assume that they were killed, but they actually weren't. And once again, Devarim was probably referring to a previous reading, but it implied that it kind of destroyed them on the inside, that they would never be the same.
Well, I'm not sure which verse you're referring to, but
I'll try to find it.
Okay. So I want to read from Nechama Leibowitz with regard to the verse I just chanted. And I hope you'll indulge with me. It can be a little esoteric and a little difficult to comprehend, but it's worth it to get to the end. It's called Living and Existence. According to Nachmanides, the end of the 3rd chapter of Deuteronomy, which coincides with the beginning of our Sedra, marks the close of Moses' introductory discourse to the book, as I've told you already. In that discourse, he had described the retribution that had overtaken the generation of the Exodus for disobedience and assured the new generation that they would inherit the promised land, if only they would not follow in their father's footsteps. After this introduction, Moses proceeded to the real subject of the book, a recapitulation of the precepts of Judaism, after which our book is known as Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the law. And of course, that's the name of the Rambam's seminal corpus Mishnah Torah. Mishnah is repetition or copy. Torah, instruction. Mishnah can also mean learning. So Mishnah, Torah, the learning of the instructions, which they were bidden neither to add to or diminish therefrom. Here are the 4 verses which act as a preface to Moses' imparting of the commandments. So here come verses 1 through 4. And now, Israel, hearken unto the statutes, unto the ordinances, which I teach you, do them, that you may live. Go in and possess the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, give you. Do not add to the message which I have commanded you, neither shall you diminish from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did in Baal Peor. For all the men that followed the Baal of Peor, the Lord thy God had destroyed them from the midst of thee, and they were destroyed by the plague. Verse 4, which I just chanted, but you that cleave to the Lord your God are alive, every one of you this day. So verse 1 is a general summons to obedience to carry out the 2 main types of precepts, statutes and ordinances, or some say judgments. The reward held out is that you may live and possess the land. So the reward for following God's statutes and ordinances is that you're going to be alive and you will take the land that God promised. Remember, it was a covenant. It is conditional. We find in Leviticus 18 that a similar reward was promised for observance of the divine commands, quote, which if a man do, he shall live by them, end quote. The connection between verse 1 and 2 is quite clear. Obedience to the divine commands as a whole is first called for, followed by an admonition faithfully to observe their details exactly as God had commanded them, not arbitrarily to add our own subjective interpretations. Our commentators, however, have been puzzled by the addition of the phrase, quote, neither shall ye diminish, end quote. The Torah had admittedly to warn man not to imagine that he could improve on the commands by doing more than God had ordered. He might think that additions were therefore permissible. But surely any diminution was expressly forbidden by the earlier admonition to hearken to the statutes and ordinances, which is the prohibitive commandments. Anything less than those statutes and ordinances constituted disobedience. We must therefore conclude that this prohibition not to diminish has a special connotation. Here is the explanation of the offer of Ahmet Davar, and here it comes. This admonition follows the phrase, quote, that you may live, to imply that, though there are other means of achieving communion with the divine, by sacrifice, fasts, abstinences, etc., it is far better to attain godliness through the statutes and ordinances of the Torah. Ye shall not add, therefore implies that you should take care that these other means, not sanctioned by the Torah, do not lead you to add to tradition, even if such addition springs from a desire to improve your observance and is performed out of love of God. So regardless of your intention or your motivation, to add to these commandments outside of what God is saying is wrong. It's sort of like Nadav and Avihu who offered strange fire. If ye shall not ye shall not diminish from the laws of tradition in order to better perform them. In other words, not the slightest deviation in the manner of observance is permitted, even out of the best of intentions, in order to achieve greater closeness to God. The text itself may be said to support such an interpretation when it calls on the Jews not to add or diminish, quote, that you may keep the commandments, end quote, i.e., even if your adding or diminishing is inspired by the purpose of keeping the commandments. According to this interpretation, the text is aimed at, quote, the fit, though few, end quote, who may be tempted to disparage some details of the Torah from an overabundance of religious ecstasy, looking down from their pedestal of mystic elevation and considering themselves released from the prosaic discipline of Jewish precept. I am so high, I'm so elevated, I'm so spiritual. Certainly my interpretation will add to my devotion to God. Another explanation is advanced by the Kli Yakar. The passage urging us not to add or diminish constitutes one single admonition. We are actually bidden by the text not to add to the Torah's precepts. If we observe this, then we shall automatically be saved from the pitfall of diminishing. So what he's saying is, if we observe by not adding, then automatically we'll be saved from the pitfall of taking away or diminishing. The text is to read as follows, quote, "Do not add to the message which I have commanded you, and you will not diminish therefrom," end quote. The second verb phrase is a clause of result. Only the first is imperative. Do not add to the message. As soon as man begins to apply his own subjective judgment to the observance of Judaism, then there is no telling how far he will go. Do not add, warns the Torah, and you will not come to diminishing. This is in line with a well-known rabbinic dictum which reads, quote, "Whoever adds, thereby diminishes." Ponder that. Think about that's your thought for the day. Whoever adds, thereby diminishes. So when you, through your own interpretation, seek to elevate your religious observance by adding, you're in effect diminishing, because God did not command it that way. Any addition is bound to lead to a diminution somewhere, upsetting the balance of the general framework of Judaism. What now is the logical connection between this admonition not to deviate in the slightest from the demands of Judaism in verse 2 and the reference to the deadly retribution meted out to the Israelites who sinned with the Baal Peor in verse 3? Did then the sin of Baal Peor represent an addition to or diminution from the precepts? Surely it was an outright violation of the very foundation of the Torah. Ibn Ezra sensed this non sequitur, which he strove to dispose of in his own cryptic comments to the text. On the phrase in verse 1, "that you may live," he comments, "since the worshippers of Beor were destroyed." So he's connecting verse 2 with verse 3. Do not add to or subtract from, observe God's commandments, that you may live, since the worshippers of Baal Peor were destroyed. On the phrase your eyes have seen in verse 3, he comments, quote, "But he who did not worship at Baal Peor is alive," end quote. He thus connects verse 3 not with the preceding one, but with verse 1. Verse 1 states that if the Israelites obey, they will live, and the proof is what happened at Baal Peor. Those who disobeyed lived. Verse 2 is in parenthesis. Ibn Ezra, however, takes a very narrow literal view of the term live and alive in the passage. And this may give some insights or comments to Bob's question a moment ago. Is the cleaving to God alluded to in verse 4 nothing more positive than the non-indulgence in the worship of Baal Peor? Surely cleaving to God represents more than that. Here is how Rabbi Kook elaborated on this phrase in his introduction to his work, Chabad Ha'aretz, the Sabbath of the land, on the laws of the sabbatical year. So here's what Rabbi Kook has to say about Shemitah. For what great nation is there that hath God so nigh unto them? The uniqueness of the house of Israel lies in the fact that it views existence from the vantage point of holiness. From the vantage point of holiness. It senses with all the strength of its being that life only possesses value to the extent that it is godly, and that life, which is not godly, is worth nothing. It perceives that a life which is not godly is not to be termed life at all. This conviction sets its own unique impress on every individual Jew. The light and salvation of the individual is dependent on the extent of his appreciation of the essential godliness of true existence. Ye that did cleave unto the Lord are alive, not just live, but alive, every one of you this day, end quote. So Rav Kook looks at spiritual death as opposed to physical death and says that's worse. And that's the difference between living and existing. Living, being alive, is accepting holiness and godliness, not just in your mind, but in your actions.
Thanks, dude.
Rabbi
That did
Kook, let me finish reading, please. Rabbi Kook differed in two respects from Ibn Ezra's understanding of the term life in the text. Life is not viewed as the opposite of death, physical destruction, but as the opposite to mere vegetative existence. So for Rav Kook, death is vegetative existence, not necessarily physical death. To the life which appears superficially to be living, but which is in reality, quote, not to be termed life at all. It is not therefore a question of choosing between life and death in the biological sense, as Ibn Ezra observes, but between life and mere existence in the spiritual context. The second divergence between the two approaches lies in the understanding of the term, quote, cleave unto God. Cleave is devakah. Devakah is to cleave. A very important term in the Kabbalah. Ibn Ezra takes this to imply avoidance of idolatry. So from Ibn Ezra, who looks as physical death, what they're talking about, he connects it to Baal Peor, which is idolatry, and they died in a plague. Rabbi Kook, the giving of life on its proper spiritual plane, quote, the appreciation of the essential godliness of true existence, end quote. The greater this appreciation and perception, the more is such a person said to, quote, cleave unto God, end quote. According to Rabbi Kook, this latter phrase implies a maximal achievement. According to Ibn Ezra, a minimal one. Two Jews, three opinions, right? The maximal interpretation of the expression cleaving unto God is supported by another passage in Deuteronomy, where it occurs as the climax of the full measure of obedience and identity with the divine will, which we read in chapter 13, verse 5. After the Lord your God shall you walk, and him shall you fear, and his commandments shall you keep, and unto his voice shall you hearken, and him shall you serve, and unto him shall you cleave. So, two ways of interpreting a verse. There's no right or wrong. There's lessons to be gained and extracted from both approaches. And to me, that was worth the big chunk of time we devoted to verse 2. Any thoughts, questions, comments before we move on? All right, now we're going to turn to verses 5 through 8. The basic point of these three verses, or 4, excuse me, is Israel's greatness and wisdom will be manifested in obedience to divine commandments. After all, the eyes of all the world are upon us. We are to be the light unto the nations. Let's look at verse 5. See, Re'eh, see, I have taught you statutes and laws, Chukim umishpatim, as I was commanded by Adonai, my God, to fulfill within the land that you are arriving here to inherit. Now again, Moses says, my God, not your God, because this is Moses's narrative. Verse 6, you will preserve and you will fulfill them, for that displays your wisdom and your understanding. Chokhmah is wisdom. Bina is understanding. Before the nations, who will hear all these statutes and will say, the only wise and understanding people is this great nation. So when we accept and embrace our Judaism, when we're not embarrassed by our Judaism, when we're out among the nations, that's when we get the respect of the other nations. Not when we shirk our duties and responsibilities. That's when the other nations don't respect us. And that's particularly when anti-Semitism rears its ugly head. Verse 7, for who is a great nation that has God close to it as Adonai, our God, whenever we call to him? We are the only nation that has a direct connection to Hashem. He's there when we call him. He's always near. We don't need an intermediary. 8. I want to read Hersh on page 757. Well, let me read the verse first. And who is a great nation that has upright statutes and laws like this entire Torah that I am putting before you today? So Hersh has this to say about that verse. Israel's religion is likewise unique through the ethical character and righteousness of its laws for the government of human society. Cardinal Faulhaber, after reviewing the poor laws, the rights of labor, the administration of justice found in the Torah, placed the following alternative before the Nazi detractors of the Hebrew scriptures. Either such laws are divinely inspired, or they are the product of a people endowed above all other people with positive genius for ethical and social values. The cradle of humanity, he declared, is not in Greece. It is in Palestine, which is what they referred to Israel in those days. Those who do not regard these books as the word of God and as divine revelation must admit that Israel is the super people in the history of the world. For the tribute to Israel paid a generation before Faulhaber, by Leo Tolstoy, he goes on to give that where you can find it. So Rashi says, upright and proper. Upright means proper and acceptable, not literally righteous, not tzaddik, but right and proper and acceptable, which means it's just and relevant, because only people can be righteous. Laws in and of themselves aren't righteous. The laws and ordinances and testimonies are just and relevant. It is us, people, who make them righteous through our actions, through our deeds. We are about deed, not creed. Everything in Judaism is about actions. So now, verses 9 to 24. Basically, lest ye forget. So Moses is going to remind us. So let's read what Hersh has to say about verses 9 to 24. Lest ye forget that the basic principle of God's law is the spirituality of God and his abhorrence of all idolatrous representation of him. So now I'm going to read verse 9 and then continue. Verse 9, let me get there. Look for yourself and guard your life exceedingly, lest you forget the words your eyes witnessed, lest they were removed from your mind all the days of your life. You will make them known to your children and to your grandchildren. Now it's interesting, at least in this translation, Rashi, the words your eyes witness. You hear words, you don't see words. But I'm reminded of the hail inside the fire in one of the plagues, which can't coexist, except God made that miracle so that the hail was encapsulated within the balls of fire, or vice versa. I'd have to go back to the text to read it again. But both contrary types of nature coexisted because God commanded it that way. And just as the Israelites witnessed the first two commandments and then said, Moses, we can't take it anymore. Please tell us what the other 8 are. So too, they saw the words. Pretty cool. So now, verses 10 through 14, I want to read out of the Chabad Torah. The divine revelation you experienced on the day you stood before God, your God, at Mount Horeb, when God said to me, assemble the people for me. I will let them hear my words in order that they learn to revere me all the days that they live on earth, and in order that they teach their children. And we know from Rabbi Epstein's class yesterday, that is job 1. Teach your children to revere me as well. 11. You approached and stood at the foot of the mountain. The mountain burned with fire that rose up to the midst of heaven and was enveloped by 3 degrees of obscurity, darkness, a normal cloud, and a thick cloud. God made his own special effects before CGI. Verse 12. God spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the word, but saw no image. You only heard God's voice. 13. He told you the terms of his covenant, the Torah, that he commanded you to observe, and summarized it in the 10 Commandments. And he inscribed the 10 Commandments on 2 stone tablets. God, 14, God commanded me at that time, during my first 40 days on Har Sinai, after the giving of the Torah, to teach you the oral explanation of the rules and ordinances, so that you would perform them properly in the land into which you are crossing in order to possess. So notice, as the overview stated, Moses knows he's not going after pleading and being rejected, and that's, he says, into the land which you are crossing in order to possess. Now, 15 through 22 verses, our entrance to the promised land is contingent upon loyalty to God. A brit is a covenant. It's conditional. If party A does this, party B will do this. So here's the loyalty unto God. Now I want to read from Hersh. It's a little lengthy. Please indulge me, about religious tolerance. God had suffered the heathens to worship the sun, moon, and stars as a stepping stone to a higher stage of religious belief. That worship of the heathen nations thus forms part of God's guidance of humanity. Excuse me. But as for the Israelites, God had given them first-hand knowledge of him through the medium of revelation. It is for this reason that idolatry was, for them, an unpardonable offense. And everything that might seduce them from that divine revelation was to be ruthlessly destroyed. Hence, the amazing tolerance shown by Judaism of all ages toward the followers of other cults, so long as these were not steeped in immorality and crime, which is why God commanded the Amalekites and the Canaanites to be eradicated. Not that they were pagans, but that their culture was steeped in immorality and crime. Thus, the prophet Malachi declares even the sacrificial offerings of heathens to be a glorification of God. Equally striking is the attitude of the rabbis toward the heathen world. War had been declared against Canaanites not because of matters of dogma or ritual, but because of the savage cruelty and foul licentiousness of their lives and cults. But the rabbis never regarded the heathens of their own day on the same moral level with the Canaanites. The contemporary heathens in the Roman and Persian empires obeyed the laws of conduct which the rabbis deemed vital to the existence of human society, the so-called 7 Noahide mitzvot, of which all Gentile nations are obligated to observe. They wisely held that in their religious life, these heathens merely followed the traditional worship which they had inherited from their fathers before them, and they could not therefore be held responsible for failure to reach a true notion of the unity of God. Such followers of other faiths, they taught, were judged by God purely by their moral life. As I've said before, God speaks to all people, different peoples in different ways, and all have a stake in heaven. We do not say ours is the only way and everyone else is excluded. Ours is the only way for us. But God judges all nations as to their morality or lack thereof. The righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come, and are heirs of immorality alongside the righteous in Israel. A later midrash proclaimed, I call heaven and earth to witness that, whether it be Jew or heathen, man or woman, free man or bondman, only according to their acts does divine spirit rest upon them. And in the darkest days of the Middle Ages, Solomon ibn Gabriel, the great philosopher and synagogue hymn writer, sang, quote, Thou art the Lord, and all beings are your servants, your domain, and through those who serve idols vain, thine honor is not detracted from, for they all aim to thee to come. This is probably the earliest enunciation of religious tolerance in Western Europe. So it's not my way or the highway. If you live an ethical and moral life and you abide by the 7 Noahide laws, you have a stake in the world to come. So let's go into the verses now. Verse 15, be extremely cautious for your lives, for you did not see any image on the day Adonai addressed you at Horeb from within the fire. That's where he said you heard the words. 16, lest you destructively make for yourselves a statue in the image of any form. the representation of a male or a female. 17, or the representation of any animal that is on earth, or the representation of any winged bird that flies in the sky. 18, or the representation of anything that crawls on the ground, or the representation of any fish that is in the water beneath the earth. 19, lest you raise your eyes heavenward and see the sun or the moon and the stars, the entire host of the heaven, and you will err and bow to them and worship them when Adonai your God has made them available to all the peoples who are under the whole sky. God is not nature. God created nature. God exists outside of time and space. Time and space are created matter that allow and permit us in a physical form to exist. Verse 20. But you, Adonai, took for himself when he took you out of the iron crucible from Egypt, to be for him a people like this day. 21. Yet God grew angry at me on account of your statements, and he swore that I would not cross the Jordan, and he would not enter the good land that Adonai your God is giving you as territory. 22, for I am to die in this land. So Moses is basically laying a guilt trip on the people in an effort to admonish them to follow God's commandments. For I am to die in this land. I am not crossing the Jordan, but you are crossing and will inherit this good land. Verse 23. Look out for yourselves, lest you forget. That same verbiage again, lest you forget the covenant of God, Adonai your God, that he made with you, and make for yourselves a statue, an image of anything that Adonai your God commanded you. So that's why, yes, Janet.
So when it talks about not making a graven image of a person, how do we reconcile Christianity with Judaism when basically they're worshiping a graven image? Because all over they show pictures of Jesus.
We can't
So is that
reconcile that. That's
another reason that we would
that's
reject
a line
that.
we couldn't cross, and that's why through the millennium you see Jewish art. I mean, you didn't see it was Michelangelo that made David a Gentile. There was no images made for that very reason. So otherwise you would be like the pagans. So you could not, God has no image or form. Right. God is acorporeal. So yeah, that's irreconcilable with us.
Yeah, so if the Christians or the followers of Jesus knew Torah, which he taught, why would they go ahead and do that knowing that it was against Torah, which is all that they knew?
Because Saul of Tarsus said that we go by grace, not by deed, and rejected most of the commandments. And it basically invented the religion of Christianity, is to accommodate and attract the pagans. So they incorporated the Christmas tree, for instance, which was the winter solstice in pagan calendar. So there were ways that Christians knew that the Jews weren't going to convert. Some did, of course, but Saul was a Jew. He became Paul, Saul of Tarsus. So to attract a broader audience, he incorporated a lot of pagan type of customs, if you will.
Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Now, verse 24, and we all have heard this verse. It's very famous. For Adonai your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. So Hersh has this to say about that: a jealous God. The Hebrew Elkanah means a zealous God, full of zeal for holiness and justice, to whom man's doings and dealings are not a matter of indifference, but who renders strict retribution for all idolatry and iniquity. It also means a jealous God. That may appear a startling description of God. It signifies that God claims the exclusive love of his children, their entire sincerity, and complete self-surrender. He will not allow the veneration and loyalty due to him alone to be shared with other objects of worship. This conception of a jealous God saved Israel from going under in the days of ancient heathendom, as well as in the days of Greece and Rome. None of the founders of the great heathen religions had any inkling of this idea of a jealous God, a God who would have none other gods, a God of terrible truth who would not tolerate any lurking belief in magic, witchcraft, or old customs, or any sacrificing to the God King, or any trifling with the stern unity of things. Our Father's realization that truth can make no concession to untruth, nor enter into compromise with it, without self-surrender, is responsible for the religious stand they took up to in the days of Greece and Rome. When Jerusalem fell, Rome was quite prepared to give the God of Israel a place in their pantheon. Israel absolutely refused such religious annexation. The one unique and universal God of Israel alone was a living God. Jupiter and his likes were things of naught, figments of the imagination, and the same reasons that would not permit the Jews to bend the knee to the gods of pagan Rome prevented them in later generations from allowing themselves to be absorbed by the two great religions that issued from Israel's bosom, Christianity and Islam. Here too they found, both in dogma and morality, novelties and concessions that were repugnant to the austere simplicity of their absolute monotheism. And the blessed doctrine of a jealous God is of vital importance for the Jews' attitude towards the neo-paganism of today and tomorrow. Judaism's mission is just as much to teach the world that there are false gods and false ideals, as it is to bring it near to the true one. Abraham, the friend of God, began his career, according to the legend, with breaking idols. That's what the Midrash tells us. And it is his particular glory to have been in opposition to the whole world, which is why we are Ivri, the other, which is where Hebrew came from. Ivri means the other side. And that's the way it has been and will continue to be. Now, we're coming into verses 25 through 40. This is a significant passages of Torah. Why? Because on Tisha B'Av, which starts this Wednesday evening, those that are in shul on Thursday and are fasting will read this passage, 25 through 40 in chapter 4, because it tells how Israel will lapse into exile and find its way back. So these passages, there's no coincidences in life. The fact that this passage is read right before Tisha B'Av, that there's a reason. And these particular verses, which we're going to read, will hopefully help you understand. Now in verse 25, when you have children and grandchildren and have grown old in the land, and you will be corrupt and make a statue, an image of anything, and do what is evil in the eyes of Adonai your God to anger him. So Moses has the benefit of prophecy. He knows what's coming. And he's warning the people of what will happen. So, verse 26. Here, this should be very familiar. I bring as witness against you today, heaven and earth. We read in one of the prophets recently about heaven and earth as witness. And Moses here was the first to call on heaven and earth as witnesses, which he does a few times in the book of Devarim. That you will be completely and swiftly removed from upon the land, that you are crossing the Jordan there to inherit, but you will not live long upon it, but will be completely destroyed. Now, what he means by completely destroyed is exiled from the land, which is the same as death. So, verse 27. Adonai will disperse you among the peoples. And the fact that the very next verse tells you this is an insight into what completely destroyed means. Because in ancient times, if you were excommunicated from your people, think of the barbaric practice of infanticide, when a baby was not wanted and left out, or the Greeks commonly, if someone fell from grace, they were exiled, sometimes 10 years or more, and it was as though they were dead. Adonai will disperse you among the peoples. You will remain few in number, the opposite of the promise to Abraham, among the nations that Adonai leads you to. Verse 28. You will serve idols. Let's read it. There you will serve man-made gods of wood and stone that do not see, do not hear, do not eat, and do not smell. Now, that doesn't mean that the Jews will themselves serve idols as much as since you serve those who worship them when you're in exile and you have to follow the laws of the territory that you live in. Since you serve those who worship them, it will be considered as though you yourself are worshiping idols, which is why you got there in the first place. Now, when I read, you will serve man-made gods of wood and stone that do not see, do not hear, do not eat, and do not smell, I'm reminded of Tehillim, Hallel, those verses 113 through 118 that we say on festivals, Hanukkah, etc. And this is what King David had to say. Our God is in the heavens. Whatever he pleases, he does. Their idols are silver and gold, the handiwork of man. They have a mouth but cannot speak. They have eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear. They have a nose but cannot smell. Their hands, they cannot feel. Their feet, they cannot walk. They cannot utter a sound from their throat. Those who make them should become like them, whoever trusts in them. So King David is, I'm sure, harking back in thought to these very words of Torah that Moses was speaking to the children. Verse 29. You will seek from there Adonai your God, you will find him. When you seek him wholeheartedly with your whole being. Now to me, that's a precursor to the V'ahavta. You will love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your being. So Moses is saying, seek him wholeheartedly and with your whole being. That brings to my mind the V'ahavta. What it also tells me Again, I've said it many times, it takes an arousal from below to create an arousal from above. And there's another verse that supports that. God is always there. The station is always transmitting, but you have to turn on the radio. Moving on.
This is the same concept that the Israelites in Egypt had sunk to the bottom, and that's when they realized they had to come up again. And this is the same reference.
Good point. Yes, sir. Thank you. Now, verse 30. When you are in distress, and all these things happen to you at the end of time, you will return to Adonai your God and will obey him. Now, this is a hint to the Mashiach. And there's very few references in the Chumash to the end of time, to Messiah. This is one of them. And it's coming from Moshe Rabbeinu. Verse 31. For a merciful Almighty is Adonai your God. He will not forsake you, nor destroy you, nor will he forget the covenant of your fathers that he swore to them. So while the branches come and go, and branches, remember we talked about a branch that was connected to the root, and those that were snapped off, losing their vitality, the root will always remain intact. Even when God plagues, destroys, persecutes, whatever adjective you want to use, the root of Israel will always remain intact. 32 through 40 now addresses the uniqueness of Israel's God. Inquire now about the early years that preceded you, from the day that God created Adam on earth, and from one end of the heavens to the other end of the heavens. Did anything ever happen comparable to this great event? Or did anyone ever hear of such a thing? So God is the creator of all, as again we studied in yesterday's class. Everything is attached to godliness. Nothing can live outside of God. God's creative power is in all that is new. That's what we read in our Siddur. Inquire now about the early years of, I read that already, forgive me. Verse 33. Did any people ever hear God's voice speaking from within the fire as you heard and survive? So, as we know, you can't have a direct communication with God and live. But yet, this is what happened. God spoke from within the fire, and you heard and you lived. Even though the Midrash says that all the souls from the people escaped out of their bodies and returned after the first commandment, then upon the second commandment, all their souls left their bodies and returned. And that's when the people of Israel said, Moses, we can't do this anymore. Please have God speak to you and tell us the other commandments. Verse 34. Or did any God ever miraculously come and take for himself a nation from within a nation through tests, with signs, with wonders, through warfare, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, and with great displays, entirely as Adonai your God did for you in Egypt, as you watched? You were witnesses. So God is the only reality which you witness firsthand. "36. From the sky he made audible to you his voice to teach you, and on the earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from within the fire." 37. Because he loved your forefathers, he chose his descendants after him, and he took you out before him with his great strength from Egypt. 38. To expel nations greater and stronger than you from before you, to bring you and give you their land as territory like this day. Egypt was the most powerful kingdom on earth at that time. And they were subjugated because of God. 39. 39 is connected to verse 35. Let's read verse 35 again, and then I'll read 39. You have been shown that you might know that Adonai, he is God. There is no power other than he. Verse 39. You will know today and restore to your perception that Adonai is the God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. As we say, Ein od, Ein od. There is no one. There is no other. God is the only one. Verse 40. Oh, I want to read, before I read verse 40, there's some Hasidic insights that I want to read to you about. There is no reality besides him. There is no other reality. In verse 35, Moses tells the people that when God gave the Torah, he showed him there is no other reality other than him. In verse 39, Moses tells them they should not rely on the recollection of this revelation, but rather respond to it by striving to know God on their own as well. So it's not enough that you saw this on your own. You need to internalize it, ponder it. Thus, there is no mention of heaven and earth in verse 35 as there is in verse 39, because when God pulled back the veil in order to show the people that he is the only reality, the focus was on the presence of God, not on the nature of reality. The force of God's revelation was so overwhelming that all other reality simply disappeared from everyone's consciousness. In contrast, when we are working from our earthly perspective, aspire to knowledge of God, the nature of reality is a very real issue. Hence, the necessity of bringing the awareness that God is God into heaven above and earth below, because that's how we perceive. That's how our intellect can wrap its head around this concept. For the same reason, verse 35, which describes God's self-revelation, ends with the phrase, quote, there is no other reality besides him, end quote, implying that in the face of that revelation, there is indeed nothing other than God at all. Whereas verse 39, describing our upward climb to divine knowledge, ends only with the words, there is no other reality, implying by contrast from our perspective, there is indeed a reality beside him, but that we are aware that it possesses no intrinsic existence on its own. So all the physical world is, I don't want to say a ruse, but a mirage, because without God's constant input into creation, it would cease to exist. So that God has withdrawn his presence, so the physical reality, creation, is there. Because if he didn't, it's just like if we went into the rays of the sun, we would be absorbed within the sun itself. Just like the rays of sun only have an expression when they leave the sun and come to us as light. So verse 40. In order to achieve this awareness, God has given you the Torah and its commandments. You must therefore observe his rules and his commandments, which I am commanding you today, so that it may go well with you and your children after you, and that you may prolong your days upon the land that God your God is giving to you forever. Now, verses 41 through 43 have to do with the cities of refuge. And then on verse 44 through 49 begins Moses' second discourse. And of course, we will cover that next week and when we get into Ikev. So there's a lot of deep stuff in there to ponder. Anyone have any comments before we move on to the Haftorah?
If you think about everything that Moses was saying, he refers a lot to the fact that the people actually saw this. But if you remember, this generation, probably most of them were not there at Sinai, because these are the
Correct.
people that survived. But right at the beginning, when it talked about what they saw at Baal Peor, the implication is the same, because this generation actually saw what happened. So there is a thread that carries it through.
Thank you for that extra elaboration, because that's a very good point and one to keep in our minds. We now turn to the Haftorah. We have left the 3 Haftorot of rebuke or admonition. And with Va'etchanan, since it's chanted after Tisha B'Av, comes the first Torah of comfort, of consolation. And fittingly and appropriately, it's from Yeshayahu, Isaiah.
And Shabbos Nachamu.
Correct. Which is the first 2 words of the Haftorah. So this begins the first of 7 Haftorot of consolation. So there's no thematic connection to the Torah other than it speaks of Israel's exile and return, which is alluded to in the Parsha Va'etchanan. Now, let me get, I'm sorry, forgive me. Let me get there.
While Stuart is looking that page up, let me just make a side comment. This portion, the Haftarot of Consolation, are interesting in that they were pirated, and a lot of the commentary that's in this actually appears in Handel's Messiah. It was all pirated by non-Jews.
Yeah. So, yeah. Now, if you're in Hersh, you can find it on page 776.
Did you say you want to know where it hurts?
Yeah. Doctor, it hurts when I do this. Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah. So I'm going to read the commentary of Hirsch, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, which is a modern, an Orthodox great sage who lived in about 100 years ago, and you've heard me use his commentary when we're reading from the book of Isaiah. So here's what he has to say about chapter 40, which is, of course, from Isaiah. And remember, there's 66 chapters in the book of Isaiah, so we're well over halfway through the book of Isaiah. Following the pronouncements regarding the Babylonian exile, this chapter begins with numerous expressions of consolation and encouragement. The Jewish people were liberated from the shackles of Galut, which is exile, after Babel's conquest at the hand of the Median Persian armies recruited by Koresh, known as Cyrus. Yehuda was to return to its homeland and rebuild its national existence on the sacred soil of God's law. Imbued with the ideals of the divine teachings, the Jewish people would gain the inner strength to face the challenging diaspora of the wilderness of nations, which we're going to read in verse 3, with unswerving loyalty. Its noble task to serve as the light unto the nations will bring it and all mankind closer to the goal of the ultimate redemption. This promise forms the recurring theme of a major part of the concluding chapters of the book. Corresponding with the dramatic contents of this chapter, the language is highly poetic and elevating. It reflects the prophet's joyous sense of satisfaction at being able to promise the people the advent of a glorious future. So it begins, verses 1 and 2, with the proclamation of divine forgiveness, which is emphasized by the fact that Nachamu is said twice. Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami Yomar Elohechem. Comfort, O comfort my people, your God will say. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem, call out to her that her army service is fulfilled, that her guilt of sin has been mitigated, for she has won double from the hands of God just because of all her sins. So Jerusalem is mother to Israel. So whenever you hear about Jerusalem or Zion, Zion refers to Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the mother of Israel. So he's saying he's speaking tenderly to the heart of Israel. Now verses 3 through 5. But now a voice calls out into the desert, prepare the way of God. Clear in the wilderness the upward leading road to our God. Every valley must be raised, every mountain and hill lowered, and the crooked must become straight, and the unevenness must become level. Then the glory of God will reveal itself, and all flesh will see as one that the mouth of God has spoken. That's a common phrase among the prophets. Ki pi Adonai diber. Many prophecies in for the mouth of God has spoken. So it's legitimizing, of course, that the prophet is speaking for God. So Yeshayahu hears the sound of heavenly voices announcing that Israel's deliverance from exile is at hand. What a great message to give. Contrast that with poor Jeremiah, who for 40 years talked of the destruction of Jerusalem in exile if the people didn't mend their evil ways and stop their corruptness and idol worship. So now the voice that raises the call in verse 3 instructs the prophet to proclaim God's words to Israel and mankind. Let's listen to verse 6 and 7. The voice is saying, declare, and it says what I am to declare. All flesh is grass, all its devoted love like the flower of the field. The grass dries out, the flower wilts, the breath of God blows against it. Indeed, the people is like grass, like the grass that fades. I'm reminded of high holidays, that when the cantor's chanting. 8 and 9. Only the grass dries out, only the flower wilts, but the word of our God will stand for eternity. So people come and go. That is the way of the physical world. Only one thing stands for all eternity, the word of God. Raise yourself, verse 9, up to the high mountain, herald of Sown. Raise your voice with might, herald of Yerushalayim. Lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the cities of Yehuda, look, here is your God. So he's admonishing or telling the exiles that God has forgiven them. They need to return to their mother. Israel, as bearer of the word of God, need not despair, facing the magnitude of its task. It has the inner strength to endure the challenges. Of the exile, and should look with profound trust to the future that will bring the time of healing and peace for it and all mankind. All historical developments lead toward this ultimate goal. This timely message, clear and unequivocal, emanates from the heights. Whenever Yehuda's son dwells on earth, they are summoned, Sion, Vayi Yerushalayim, from Zion to Jerusalem to acknowledge the call. Behold, this is your God. So that's the inherent message of verses 8 and 9. Now, verse 10. Behold the Master, God, who now reveals his loving kindness and justice. So within justice is his attribute of loving kindness or mercy. He will come forth with the strong one, whose arm rules for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his workings before his countenance. So the reward is the exiles themselves, who are regarded as spoil recovered from the heathen nations. His reward is with him, God. So the exiles are the spoils, the reward coming from the lands they were exiled to. We're in the Haftorah, Ellen, chapter 40, verse 11.
Thank you.
This is one of my favorite verses right here. This is what Nachamu is all about. He pastures his herd like a shepherd, who gathers the lambs in his arms, carries them in his bosom, but guides the nursing mother. God is nursing an ailing people back to spiritual health. Imagine these words on an exiled population, what comfort it would bring them. Now, verses 12 through 26, I'm going to read Hirsch's commentary on those verses, which is where the Haftorah ends. Excuse me, I'm sorry. God's incomparable wisdom and might shown in creation and the government of the world. And yet there are those weak in faith who doubt the possibility of Israel's deliverance. There's always the naysayers, right? So let's read 12. Who has measured water with the hollow of his hand, fixed the heavens according to its span, made a measure of the dust of the earth, weighed mountains with the scale and hills on the balance? Who has comprehended the Spirit of God? Who is the man who can advise him of his counsel? With whom did he consult? Who would endow him with understanding that he would instruct him as to the path of justice? Who would teach him knowledge and let him know the way of understanding? So no mortal is capable of comprehending God's ways. As the sages say, if I could know God, I would be God. And this is what Isaiah is basically saying. Now, verses 15 to 16. Behold, nations are like the drop from a bucket, regarded as the dust on the scale. He carries off islands like the smallest atom, and the Lebanon would not be sufficient for sacrificial wood, its animal not enough for an ascent offering. So what is he saying? Nations that rebel against the divine rule will ultimately cease to exist. Any attempt to alter the preordained course of events by way of sacrifices would be heathen folly. Verse 17, all the nations are as nothing when compared to him. Only from the nothingness and vagueness are they considered by him. 18, with whom would you compare the Almighty, and what semblance would you set at his side? 19, the image perhaps that of the craftsman is cast, and the metal worker is overlaid with gold, soldering silver chains on it. Whoever has to limit himself with a gift will choose wood that will not rot, will look for a skilled craftsman to produce an image, lest it topple. So, I mean, Isaiah is saying, what utter folly is idol worship? Verse 21. Will you not realize? Will you not hear? Has it not been made known to you from the beginning? Have you failed to understand the foundations of the earth? Isaiah points to the fact that the same almighty power with which God created the universe moves and shapes the history of mankind and its goals. Your own experience has brought you to recognize this truth and the story of your past, which you heard from your forefathers. The fact that it is God who created and established the physical and ethical world order is not new for you. The sentence in Genesis in the Torah that introduces world history already teaches that it is God who created heaven and earth and who guides every detail of their development, the goal being the moral education of mankind as the foundation of heaven and earth existence. In other words, like I used to tell my kids, what is it about no that you don't understand? Is it the N or is it the O? Or as Cher said in Network, or not Network, that movie with Nicolas Cage, snap out of it. So verse 21 through 26, and I'm going to go a little quick here because it's 12:24. But this is basically saying the creator of nature is the ruler of mankind. Verse 21. I read that already. I read verse 22, so let me pick up on verse 23. He gives ruling nations over to nothingness, as he made the judges of the earth like chaos. 24. They were not planted or sown. Not even their trunk was rooted in the ground. He blew at them, they wilted. And the storm carried them off like stubble. Whom would you compare me with? Excuse me. Whom would you compare me with that I should resemble him, says the Holy One? And then the final verse of the Haftorah. Raise your eyes on high and see. Who created these? Who leads forth their hosts by their numbers? He calls on all of them by name. With the abundance of power and superior strength, not one is missing. So Isaiah is saying, look up to heaven and behold the multitudes in the starry sky, all together, an army whose soldiers without exception follow the call that places each on his assigned post. So his metaphor of the stars in the sky is to like an army that obeys the commands of the officer to which they report. In the realm of human beings who are endowed with freedom of will, the time will come when all people will dedicate themselves freely to the promotion of moral values. The greater their intellectual and physical strength, the more joyfully and effectively they will take their places in the ranks of a God serving mankind. God has given to each of these stars a special name, has created in its own particular shape, and has designated each one for a special task. The enormous potential and sheer force of energy that God bestows on man enables him to overcome all difficulty. Think of the power of one man, Abraham, changed the entire history of the world, brought the concept of ethical monotheism to the world. So whenever you sit and think, I'm one person, what can I do? As it says in K'avot, I'm paraphrasing, it is you are not obligated to complete the task, but neither are you absolved from doing your share. That's why you exist. That's why you have a soul and a physical body. You each have a mission to fulfill. Fulfilling your purpose, finding your mission, will give you that peace of mind, that satisfaction that we all strive for, knowing your purpose in life and having the ability that God gave you to fulfill it. Ken Yehi Sown. May it be God's will.